The cowboy would swear for the rest of his life that he fell in love with her before he ever pulled her free, though any sensible man would say that was impossible, especially considering the fact that she was waist-deep in quicksand at the time, laughing like the desert itself had just told her a joke. The sound reached him first, drifting across the barren stretch of cracked earth and brittle sage like something out of place in a land that usually only knew the howl of wind and the echo of gunfire, and Colt Maddox pulled his horse to a halt without quite understanding why, his instincts sharpening as if he had just caught the scent of trouble on the air. He had been riding hard since sunrise, tracking a pair of rustlers headed east toward Red Mesa, his mind fixed on the job and the money waiting at the end of it. But that laughter cut clean through his focus, bright and unrestrained, and so utterly wrong for a place where men died thirsty or alone that it made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. For a moment he considered ignoring it, because he was not the kind of man who went chasing strange sounds across hostile land, and because anything that laughed out here was either foolish or dangerous, sometimes both. But something in that sound tugged at him in a way he could not explain, and before he could talk himself out of it, he was nudging his horse forward, weaving between low scrub and patches of pale sand until the ground began to change beneath him. He recognized the signs too late to stop entirely, the subtle darkening of the earth, the deceptive smoothness that marked a hidden trap, and he swung down from the saddle, leading his horse carefully by the reins as he scanned the area ahead. That was when he saw her. She stood, or rather, she was stuck, in the middle of a wide patch of shifting quicksand, her boots and skirts swallowed up to her hips, her arms stretched slightly out to the sides, as if she were balancing on an invisible line, and her head was tipped back in helpless laughter that shook her whole body. Her hair, dark as storm clouds, had come loose and clung in wild strands to her face and shoulders, and her dress, once something fine enough to mark her as no ordinary drifter, was streaked with dust and damp where the sand had begun to claim it, but none of that seemed to concern her in the slightest. She was laughing like she had stumbled into the most ridiculous situation imaginable, like the desert had not just decided to swallow her whole. Colt stopped dead at the edge of the solid ground, staring at her as if he had stepped into some kind of fever dream, his hand resting near his revolver out of habit, even though there was no threat here that bullets could solve. In his 32 years he had seen fear in every form a person could wear, had watched men beg, curse, pray, and break when faced with death, but he had never seen anyone laugh at it like this. It struck him then, sudden and hard as a blow to the chest, that there was something profoundly different about her, something that made the world seem sharper and stranger just by existing in it. And before he even spoke, before he even moved to help her, he felt something shift inside him, something dangerous and undeniable that had no business taking root in a moment like this. "You planning on staying there?" he called out, his voice rough from disuse and heat. "Were you just enjoying the scenery?" Her laughter broke off just long enough for her to look at him, and when her eyes met his, bright and alive despite the situation she was in, she smiled in a way that made his pulse kick harder against his ribs. "Well," she said, breathless but amused, "if the earth decided to eat me, I figure I might as well give it a good story to remember." Colt blinked, caught off guard by the easy humor in her tone, and shook his head slightly, as if to clear it. "Most folks don't joke about dying," he muttered, stepping a little closer, but keeping his weight carefully balanced. "Most folks don't get stuck like this, either," she shot back, glancing down at the sand that shifted ominously around her waist. "Seems a shame to waste the experience by being miserable about it." He huffed out something that might have been a laugh despite himself, even as his eyes scanned the ground, calculating distance and risk, noting the way the quicksand spread in an uneven patch that could easily trap a second fool if he wasn't careful. "You always this calm when you're in trouble?" he asked. "I wouldn't say calm," she replied, her grin widening. "But I found panic doesn't help much. Laughter's at least more pleasant." There was a pause, the kind that stretched just long enough for something unspoken to settle between them, and Colt realized he was staring again, taking in the curve of her face, the stubborn lift of her chin, the spark in her eyes that refused to dim even now. He dragged his gaze away with effort and moved back toward his horse, uncoiling the rope from his saddle with practiced hands. "Name's Colt," he said shortly, more to ground himself than anything else. And unless you prefer to stay there, I suggest you listen close. Lila, she replied, as if introductions in the middle of a life-threatening situation were the most natural thing in the world. And I'd very much prefer not to become part of the landscape, so I'm all ears. He nodded once, tossing one end of the rope toward her, watching as she caught it with surprising ease despite her precarious position. Tie it around yourself, under your arms if you can manage it, he instructed. Tight. That ground's not going to let go easy. She followed his directions without argument, her movements careful but steady, and as she worked, he found himself watching her again, noticing the way her hands didn't shake, the way she bit her lip in concentration but never once lost that underlying spark of amusement. It made no sense to him, and yet it pulled at him all the same, like a thread he couldn't help but follow. By the time she finished securing the rope, he had wrapped the other end around his saddle horn and checked his footing twice over, his jaw set with focus even as something deeper stirred beneath it. Ready, he called. As I'll ever be, she answered, lifting her chin slightly. He took a breath, steadying himself, and gave the command, his horse leaning into the pole as the rope went taut, the sand resisting at first with a stubborn grip that made his muscles strain and his boots dig into the earth. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, slowly, inch by inch, she began to rise, the quicksand releasing her with a reluctant, sucking drag that seemed almost alive, and Colt found himself holding his breath, not just because of the danger, but because somewhere in the middle of it all, he realized that whatever happened next, whether he got her out or not, his life had already changed the moment he heard her laugh. Colt would later think that saving her should have been the hardest part, but it wasn't the pulling or the strain or even the risk of being dragged under with her that stayed with him. It was the moment she stumbled free and fell straight into him, breathless and alive, still laughing like she hadn't just brushed against death. The force of it knocked him back a step, his boots sliding slightly on the loose ground as his arms came up instinctively to catch her, one wrapping around her waist while the other steadied her shoulder. And suddenly she was pressed against him, close enough that he could feel the rapid rise and fall of her breathing and the quick, steady beat of her heart. For a second, just one, they stood like that, suspended between danger and relief, the desert stretching silent around them as if holding its breath. Then she tipped her head back and laughed again, softer this time, but no less genuine, and the sound did something to him that he couldn't quite name. Well, she said, brushing a strand of damp hair from her face, I suppose I owe you my life. You owe me not wandering into quicksand again, he replied, though there was no real bite in his voice. He stepped back reluctantly, his hands lingering a fraction longer than necessary before he let go, suddenly aware of how close they had been and how easily that closeness had felt right. Lila tilted her head, studying him with open curiosity, as if he were the unusual one in this situation. You always catch strangers like that? She asked. Only the ones trying to get themselves killed, he said, reaching down to gather the slack of the rope, coiling it with practiced movements to keep his hands busy. He could still feel the warmth of her where she had pressed against him, and it unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He was not a man who lingered, not in towns, not with people, and certainly not with women who laughed in the face of danger like it was a game. Seems I'd picked the right day to make a bad decision. Then, she said lightly, stepping carefully away from the treacherous ground and onto firmer earth. She tested her footing, then gave a small, satisfied nod as if pleased to still be among the living. Colt watched her without meaning to, noting the way she carried herself, steady, unafraid, like the world had tried to knock her down more than once, and she had simply decided not to stay there. What were you doing out here? He asked finally, glancing around at the empty stretch of land. This ain't a place folks wander into by accident. Lila's smile flickered, just for a moment, and something sharper slipped into her expression, something that didn't quite match the laughter he had first heard. Let's just say I was passing through, she said, and I took a wrong step. Colt wasn't convinced, but he didn't press. He had learned long ago that people carried their reasons like hidden weapons, and asking too many questions could get a man caught. Instead, he moved to his horse, checking the saddle and gear with quiet efficiency, though his attention kept drifting back to her. She was brushing sand from her skirts now, doing a poor job of it and not seeming to care, her movements more concerned with regaining balance than appearance. You got somewhere to be? He asked, not looking at her directly. Same as you, I imagine, she replied. Somewhere that isn't here. He huffed softly at that, adjusting the cinch strap. That don't answer the question. No, she agreed, stepping closer. But it keeps things interesting. He glanced at her then, really looked, and caught something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. A flicker of urgency beneath the humor, a shadow that didn't belong to someone who laughed at quicksand for sport. It set something off in his mind, a warning bell he had learned not to ignore. You running from something? He asked bluntly. For the first time since he'd found her, Lila didn't answer right away. Her gaze shifted past him, scanning the horizon, and the air between them seemed to tighten, the easy humor giving way to something more serious. Then, just as quickly, she smiled again, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Ain't everyone, she said. Colt frowned slightly, not satisfied. But before he could push further, his horse lifted its head with a sharp snort, ears flicking back toward the ridge to the west. The change was immediate. Lila's posture went rigid, her attention snapping in the same direction, and whatever lightness had been in her demeanor vanished entirely. You hear that? She asked quietly. Colt stilled, listening. At first there was nothing but the wind brushing over dry ground. But then, faint, distant, the unmistakable rhythm of hoofs. More than one horse. Coming fast. His jaw tightened. Yeah, he said. I hear it. He turned to her slowly, studying her face, the way the laughter had drained from it, replaced by something colder, more calculating. Friends of yours? Lila let out a breath that might have been a laugh in another moment. But now it held no humor at all. Not exactly, she said. The sound of the approaching riders grew louder, carrying across the open land with increasing clarity, and Colt felt the situation shift beneath his feet just as surely as the quicksand had moments before. He had been pulled into something, whether he liked it or not. He could walk away, mount up, ride east, leave her to deal with whatever trouble she had brought down on herself. It would be the smart thing to do, the sensible thing. He glanced at her again, at the set of her shoulders, the way she stood her ground despite the danger closing in, and he knew he wasn't going anywhere. How many? He asked. Enough, she replied. He nodded once, reaching for his rifle and checking the chamber with calm precision. You any good with a gun? Lila's lips curved, just slightly. Better than I am with quicksand, she said. That was enough for him. The riders crested the ridge then, dark shapes against the burning sky, their silhouettes sharp and unmistakable, and as the distance between them closed, Colt felt something settle into place inside him. Not just the familiar readiness for a fight, but something deeper, something tied to the woman standing beside him. He had found her laughing in the face of death, and now, as danger came riding hard toward them, he realized he wasn't about to let that laughter be silenced. Not today, not while he was still breathing. Colt had been in enough gunfights to know how most of them ended. Quick, brutal, and decided by whoever kept their head when the noise started. But this one felt different from the moment the first shot cracked across the desert, because he wasn't fighting for money or reputation this time. He was fighting for the woman beside him who had laughed in the face of being swallowed whole and somehow made him believe, in the span of a single afternoon, that there was something worth standing still for. The riders came in fast, dust kicking up behind them like a storm rolling low across the ground. 6 of them at least, maybe more, their guns already drawn as they fanned out with the kind of coordination that spoke of experience and bad intentions. Colt didn't wait for them to get closer. He raised his rifle, sighted on the lead rider, and fired, the recoil steady against his shoulder as the man jerked and tumbled from the saddle, hitting the ground hard. The rest scattered slightly, returning fire in a burst of noise and chaos that shattered the stillness of the land. You've got a real talent for attracting trouble, Colt muttered, dropping behind his horse for cover as bullets kicked up dirt around them. Told you, Lila shot back, her voice sharp but steady as she crouched beside him, a revolver now in her hand like it had always belonged there. She leaned out just enough to fire, her shot clean and precise, forcing one of the riders to pull back with a curse. Colt spared her a quick glance, something like respect flashing through him. Not bad, he said. Don't sound so surprised, she replied, reloading with practiced ease. The fight pressed in around them, loud and unforgiving, the kind of chaos where hesitation got a person killed. But through it all Colt was aware of her, of where she moved, how she timed her shots, The way she stayed close without needing to be told. It felt wrong. How natural it was, like they had done this before, like they belonged on the same side of a fight neither of them had chosen. The outlaws circled wider, tried to flank them, and Colt knew they couldn't hold this position for long. "We need to move," he said, grabbing Lila's arm briefly to get her attention. "You see that ridge to the south?" She nodded, following his gaze. "If we can make it there, we've got cover. And if we don't?" she asked. He gave her a quick, crooked grin despite everything. "Then I guess we picked a poor place to stand." She huffed something that might have been a laugh, even now, and that was all the answer he needed. He fired again, forcing the nearest rider back, then grabbed the reins and swung up onto his horse in one smooth motion. "Come on," he said, reaching a hand down to her. She didn't hesitate, not for a second. Her hand slipped into his, and he hauled her up behind him, settling her against his back as he turned the horse hard toward the ridge. The world narrowed to movement and sound. The thunder of hooves, the crack of gunfire, the wind tearing past them as they rode. Lila's arm wrapped around his waist to steady herself, and he felt the press of her against him, solid and real, a reminder of exactly what he was trying to keep alive. Shots rang out behind them, one close enough that he felt the rush of air as it passed, but he didn't slow. Couldn't. The ridge rose ahead, a jagged line of rock and scrub that promised at least a fighting chance, and when they reached it, he pulled the horse up short behind a cluster of boulders, both of them sliding down quickly to take cover. The outlaws followed, but the terrain broke their formation, forcing them to approach in smaller numbers, and that was all Colt needed. The fight turned then, slower, more deliberate. Each shot counted, each movement measured, and one by one, the riders fell back or went down, until the desert grew quiet again, the echoes of gunfire fading into the vastness around them. For a long moment, neither Colt nor Lila moved. The air was thick with dust and the sharp scent of spent powder, and somewhere in the distance a horse whinnied nervously. Finally, Lila let out a breath and leaned back against the rock, her head tipping up toward the sky. "Well," she said, her voice lighter now, though still edged with adrenaline. "That could have gone worse." Colt stared at her, half in disbelief, half in something deeper he didn't want to name. "You've got a strange way of looking at things," he said. She turned her head to meet his gaze, that familiar spark returning to her eyes, and smiled. "It's kept me alive so far." He held her gaze for a second longer than necessary, something unspoken passing between them, something that had nothing to do with the fight they had just survived, and everything to do with what had brought them together in the first place. "Who were they?" he asked finally. Lila hesitated, then sighed, pushing herself upright. "Men I shouldn't have crossed," she admitted. "I won a little more than they were willing to lose, and they decided to collect it back, with interest." Colt shook his head slightly. "And now they're dead or running because of it." "Because of us," she corrected softly. That settled between them, heavier than anything that had come before, and Colt realized there was no clean way out of this now. Not for her. Not for him. He could still walk away, in theory, leave her to whatever came next, go back to the life he had before, a life of empty roads and temporary stops. But the thought of it felt wrong in a way he couldn't ignore. He looked at her, really looked, at the woman who had laughed in the face of being swallowed by the earth, and then stood her ground against a pack of killers without losing that spark. And he knew there wasn't a force on this land strong enough to make him turn his back on her now. "You got a plan?" he asked. Lila's smile softened, losing some of its edge. "Not much of one," she said. "Keep moving. Stay ahead of whoever comes next." Colt nodded slowly, then pushed himself to his feet and stepped toward his horse, checking the saddle and gear with quiet purpose. After a moment, he turned back to her and held out his hand. "Then I reckon you're not doing that alone," he said. She stared at his hand for a second, surprise flickering across her face, followed by something warmer, something that looked a lot like the beginning of trust. "You sure about that?" she asked. "You don't even know me." Colt's mouth curved slightly, that same crooked hint of a grin returning. "I know you laugh when you ought to be scared," he said. "That's enough for me." For a heartbeat, the world seemed to pause again, balanced on the edge of something new, and then Lila stepped forward and took his hand. "All right, cowboy," she said softly. "Let's see where this goes." He helped her up onto the horse, then swung up behind her, settling the reins in his hands as she leaned back against him like it was the most natural thing in the world. The sun was dropping low now, painting the desert in golden fire, and as Colt turned the horse toward the open land ahead, he realized that somewhere between the laughter and the quicksand and the gunfire, he had stopped being a man who drifted without purpose. He didn't know where the road would lead, or what kind of trouble still waited for them out there, but for the first time in a long while, he knew he wasn't riding alone, and he wasn't planning to.